Content warning. This story contains depictions of physical abuse, coercive control, stalking, and medical injury. If you are in immediate danger, contact local emergency services or a domestic violence hotline in your area. The sound was the kind of violent punctuation that rearranges thinking. For a blink, I believed something had smashed in the kitchen. Ceramics, a stupid, clumsy accident. My wrist, though, had a different vocabulary. It announced itself with a white, stupid pain that didn't let me finish the thought. My hand flopped wrong, and then my forearm folded like a bad origami, and the noise that broke the air was my bones agreeing to a very definitive split. "He broke my arm," I typed, because the body does what the mind can't. It speaks the truth when the mouth refuses. My thumbs moved before my head did, sloppy and fast, pressing words into the little blue corridor of my messages. The message was meant for my mother. I always texted her in those flat, practical ways: appointments, meds, code words for bad moods. I don't know how the wrong name came up. Maybe sleep-deprived muscle memory. Maybe the contacts list is a crowded place and my thumb is an anxious idiot. The phone only knew the path my fingers made. I watched the bubble send and felt the room double in size. Marcus was across from me, sitting in his chair like he owned the light in the room. He smiled with his mouth, which is what made everything worse. The rest of him, a tilt, a casual set of shoulders, kept the smile from being a gift. He could be bland and violent in the same breath. He was the man who made being small look like obedience. His voice cut across the apartment like an audit. "Who are you texting?" he asked, slow, like he was picking a weed by the root. I said nothing. Saying things made noise that could be catalogued later. Silence was safer. It let me pretend my arm wasn't exploding. I tasted copper, the kind that isn't literal but is memory pungent, stale coffee, old bruises, the metallic hint of holding back panic. I felt my brain buffer like a frozen video. 1 second the scene was a photograph, the next it stuttered. "Answer me," he said, and it wasn't an order to my words so much as to my face. I made my face small. He leaned forward and snatched the phone, practiced fingers reading a screen like a man reading his next concession speech. He scrolls through the conversation like he's ironing a crease he planned himself. When his eyes landed on the message, those 3 simple, fatal words, his smile narrowed to a blade. "He broke your arm," he said, repeating it as if I were explaining my own injury to someone polite. For him, the phrase was a trophy, a justification, a claim he could degrade into narrative. For me, it was the ground and the air and the impossible bright thing of pain. He didn't yell. Marcus hated spectacle unless it served him. Instead, he set the phone down face up on the coffee table and said, "You sent a text to your mother." I told a lie by omission, and it stuck to the inside of my throat. "No, Mom doesn't have my—" I stopped, because the phone on the table was doing something I couldn't control. The message thread filled with blue bubbles from people who were not my mother. Numbers, short notes, a stranger's kindness. My chest thinned and widened, like someone pulling oxygen out and then giving it back. Before I could put my hand on the table, before I could rearrange myself into less visibility, the messages multiplied. 3 small text notifications lit up the screen, each from a different number, each carrying the same odd, improbable human sentence. "We're coming. Don't text back if he's watching." Marcus picked up the phone, read the 3 replies, and didn't laugh. He moved like a retracting tide, slow, then quick. "Who's coming?" he asked, but the question was an accusation in a tuxedo. I wanted to tell him I hadn't meant to send it to anyone. That was the truth. The other truth was that I had typed and sent in a panic that felt like a brief and holy decider. This is what I do now. Type, hope, wait. Marcus's jaw worked. He looked at me with a heat I hadn't seen in months, not because he had made it, but because he recognized a fissure in his control. Fingers closed around the phone and squeezed. His thumb hit the screen, the replies opening like a set of doors. He read them loud enough for the room to hear. "We're on our way. Send location. Don't reply if he can see you." He slammed the phone down, and for a second it vibrated across the coffee table, as if the words themselves were still moving. Then he stood up. It surprised me how tall he seemed in that moment, a silhouette filling the doorway, even though he was only moving toward it. "If anyone shows up," he said, slow and careful, "you will tell me who they are." He left the apartment. Not loudly, not theatrically. He left the way someone who planned to come back might leave. Keys in pocket, a door that could be closed and reopened like a narrative with all the dramatic beats written in advance. The door shut, and the sound it made was the worst kind of punctuation, final, except not final at all. The window of quiet that followed wasn't peace. It was the hollow where surprise sat, jagged and shaking. My arm screamed. The apartment smelled like burnt toast and old shirts. I waited for the next stage, the control, the explanation, the gaslight. Marcus liked to repair and then demand gratitude for the repair. Maybe he expected me to be grateful he had left at all. Then my phone buzzed again. This time the message was not a rescue instruction, but a voice across the digital wire that felt impossible and immediate. "I'm in front of your building," a low-voiced text read. "Are you okay?" My pulse did something silly and hopeful. I typed without thinking. "I don't think he knows. I'm bleeding." There were 3 more replies, brief, efficient. "Are you sure? Is he there now? What's your building?" I didn't want to answer. The muscles in my chest tightened like cables. But then a message slid in that felt like it was made for me. "We see you. No calls. Stay where you are. Lock the deadbolt if you can. We'll be there in 10. I had never, in any world I'd allowed myself to conceive, imagined relief would come via strangers' thumbs. But here it was, precise, not sentimental. The voice on the screen felt like an extension of a hand I hadn't realized was missing. I texted back, "I can't lock the deadbolt. He has a key." The reply was immediate. "Do not move. Don't let him know you're texting. We're at the door." Marcus had left a key because of reasons he could explain to anyone who asked. Shared space, emergencies, it's convenient, and everyone would nod because he knows how to smile at social things. He had a key, and I had learned to hate the small pile of habits that made him comfortable. The key on the hook, the way he put milk back in the carton. Possession was passive there, the equipment of prettiness that became a leash. He left the key in the lock, warm, still in the door as if in case he needed to return and check on me. I tried to breathe and found it difficult. Each inhale was a fragile, careful thing. The phone buzzed. 3 knocks at the front door. On the other side of the wood were 3 lives that didn't know mine except for a series of blue bubbles that had convinced them to move. My hands trembled, and I thought of all the times people had left me alone with injuries because what I said didn't look painful enough. I thought of all the smiles Marcus had used to lobby for trust. The knocking was the kind of steady, polite, confident rhythm that belongs to men who have practiced being punctual to be useful. It felt like the sound of something else entering my life, audible, solid, maybe regretful, maybe practical. "Don't open it," the messages said. "We'll get the door. keep on the couch." I watched the man who left the key walk across the hall and test the handle, because he'd like to know what narratives he still owned. He turned the handle, and the lock clicked. There was the soft friction of his boot on the stair, then the noise of a van door shutting. My chest ticked. I didn't want to be seen on my knees, but there I was, clinging to the edge of the armrest, the couch sucker smooth under my palms, the room tilted as if someone had forgotten to level it. Another hand on the doorknob, but not his. A voice outside, rough-edged and steady, called, "Elliot, it's Wes. We're with you. Can you get the deadbolt?" For a second, I couldn't move. My fingers were not smart. They had betrayed me. But then, perhaps, because the body remembers its own survival before the mind can lobby for dignity, I levered myself across with a noise like metal scraping and reached the deadbolt with the tips of my fingers. I pushed it. The lock was stiff, but it turned. The click resounded like permission. The door opened an inch, and a face I didn't know filled the new rectangle. A broad jaw, tired eyes that checked me like one would check a fragile animal. Behind him, another face popped in for a flash, quick, smiling, fingers clutching a pastry or something that gleamed in the hall light. The last man stayed back, steadying the frame with his shoulder, hands open, palms practical. They moved through the apartment with the kind of choreography people develop when they've practiced doing things that matter. They didn't ask for passwords or interrogate me about the relationship I had chosen. Wes went quickly to the window and checked, his body efficient and protective. Dween, a small man with stainless steel hair and a mouth that smirked even when he was serious, produced a small first aid kit from a bag and began tearing strips with the kind of casual violence that made me smile despite myself. Callum, the last, came straight for me with steady, sure hands and held an ice pack with a gentleness that made the pain sharper because it was care. "Can I touch it?" Callum asked, voice low, respectful. "I won't move it without you saying so." The question, simple, human, was the most powerful boundary I'd heard. It wasn't about permission as property. It was consent as a contract of trust. I nodded, barely. He rapped the ice against the swelling and said, "This will hurt. Tell me if it gets worse." I said nothing, because speech felt like betrayal. Instead, I let him wrap a cold, clean cloth around me. Even the cloth smelled like someone who owned clean linens and thought to bring them to strangers. The bandage left a cool circle of mercy. Wes moved like a man who has eaten fear and knows how to digest it. He checked the locks, the windows, then came back to look at my face. "Do you want us to call someone?" he asked, practical. "Family? Clinic? Police? What would you be most comfortable with?" My mother, I thought reflexively, but I couldn't be sure she would be the lifeline I needed. Marcus had spent years methodically removing other people's hands, friends, exes, co-workers. "Call my mom," I said, the word smaller than the option. Dween made a joke about calling with pancakes. He always makes a joke, but his hands were steady while he rummaged for gauze and antiseptic. "We're not here to make it worse. We're here to patch you up and then get you somewhere safe." They loaded me into the van like an awkward package, blanket, cushion under the arm, polite comments about tire pressure, and the city slid by in motion blur. I leaned against the seat and pressed the ice so hard I thought maybe I would bruise it blue. The men debated quietly about routes, discretion, how to avoid cameras without sounding like a story arch for a vigilante film. They were careful with words. They joked sometimes to thin the edges of what we were doing. "Unless you bake, then we'll accept muffins." I laughed then, high and thin, and it felt like something getting air. Humor in the wrong moment is a survival tactic and also a way to recalibrate. Wes looked at me, not amused in a jokey way, more like someone marking a ledger. "Do you want us to call the police?" he asked. "I mean, officially. That has a lot of implications, but we can if you want." The word police was heavy and liminal. I understood the value of records, but I'd also seen police interviews in my head before. Patronizing questions, evidence demands, the bureaucratic cross-examination of trauma. Marcus had spent years making my reality feel foolish to others. I swallowed before I answered. "Not yet," I said. "I don't want them to take anything from me." Callum nodded. "Whatever you want to do, we'll support you in that, and we can document things if you change your mind." It was the way he said support that made something loosen inside me. Support was not instruction or order, it was an offering. Dean, in the meantime, had fetched a small travel toothbrush and handed it to me with a flourish no one else would appreciate. The simple, ridiculous intimacy of it, a toothbrush offered to a stranger in crisis, struck such a tender chord that my throat constricted with something like gratitude and shame knotted together. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Wes asked later, the question that carried the shape of the next act. I had an apartment. It had memory and grief and Marcus's passive belongings. I had both of those and also a key he'd left for himself, like an assertion that I wouldn't be able to flee his geometry without permission. I had a mother who wanted to fix things and a job that was a slow machine of survival. None of those felt like sanctuary. They looked at each other like conspirators in a soft heist. Callum said, "We have a place, temporary. It's quiet. You'll have privacy. If you want to go there just for a couple nights, it's safe." The language was careful. Temporary, privacy, not ownership. Not the kind of melodramatic rescue that converts trauma into a tidy arc. They respected the borders. Rescue wasn't a takeover, it was an option with an exit ramp. I thought about going back to the small flat with the key still in the lock, to the shelf where Marcus left his evening coffee rings, as if mapping the world. And then I thought about these three men whose names I could now put to faces. Wes with his narrow eyes and efficient hands. Dean, who made gallows humor into an art. Callum, who held bandages like he knew their sacredness. And I felt something I wasn't used to naming. Permission. They offered me a choice and an exit. That difference between being offered and being taken was a revelation. At the end of the clinic visit, as the plaster dried and the nurse explained aftercare in a low, careful tone, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was short and practical. "We're outside your building." "We're not going in. Do you want us to meet you in 20 minutes? It was an invitation and a margin. I looked at my arm, at the cast that made me feel like a monument to my own survival. I folded my fingers around the edge of the paper cup, like someone holding a small promise. "If you relate to this kind of story, stick around for the full arc," Dean muttered from across the booth, half teasing, half genuine. His joke landed as a tiny CTA to the universe. Keep listening. Come along. Don't let the pieces fall apart in silent rooms. The moment, though, felt fitting, a small human prompt that wasn't a command. The idea of someone staying with the thread of my life felt like a mercy. I told them I would meet them outside. We left the clinic, and the city was the same, only sharper. The sun had slid, and the streets gathered people who were the kinds of strangers who come alive when the day presses into evening. Cars hummed. A delivery bike rang past. A woman walked a dog, and they smiled at each other, as people do when civility is the only thing holding them together. Outside, near the curb, three silhouettes waited, each different, each persistent, each folding into the posture of someone whose job was to be available without being intrusive. When I walked toward them, slow, careful, half embarrassed and half furious, I felt exposed in the way people do when they step out from hiding. Callum came forward and offered a hand. "No ceremonies," he said. "We can walk you home if you want, or there's a place." Wes held the van door open like a promise. "We have seats.
We have plans, but we won't shove you forward. Dean handed me a sealed container, pancakes actually, warm and slightly sweet, and my stomach made a noise in reflexive gratitude. We drove not like fugitives, but like people trying to be discreet. The ride was full of small, odd silences. Every 15 minutes, Dean would crack a ridiculous joke about the word pale becoming a fashionable aesthetic and how Pale Omega would be a hit on some anime forum. He knew my online handle. They all did. Somehow a wrong number had brought them into my life, and my username stitched me to a set of people who foregrounded consent like manuals. The house they parked at later was quiet and deliberately neutral. Burnished wood, warm light, the kind of place you imagine in a photo of shelter brochures. It was a place that looked like it didn't want to be noticed and would work hard to be ordinary, so the extraordinary parts of my day didn't have to be. The doormat read welcome without being showy about it. I paused on the stoop, the cool cast on my arm weighty and ridiculous, and understood that a new kind of anxiety rotated inside me. What if sanctuary is just another room? They carried my bag inside, light touch, careful eyes, and set up a space in a small bedroom with stacked blankets, a lamp on a nightstand, a towel rolled like a pillow for my arm.
Callum arranged the pillows himself, coaxing them into fortifications. Dreen put a mug of something warm at my bedside like a talisman, and Wes, who'd been scanning windows with a professional's distrust, set a few simple measures in place. He checked the front locks, quietly, then took the living room couch and left the bathroom light on. "Stay put," he said, saying it without being overbearing. "If you want to talk, we'll listen. If you want silence, we'll respect that. If you want to sleep, I'll wake you if anything sounds off." The language was careful, because they understood that language is how you build boundaries people can trust. They didn't sleep on my terms. They offered to stay near as chosen guardians, not proprietors. At some point in the afternoon, I crawled into the bed they'd set up like an island and let the heat of the room press me. My phone lay face down on the nightstand, a small, buzzing hive of possible threats. For a while, I let the darkness do the work of therapy. When I slept, if it was sleep, it was fragmented. I dreamed of a hand on my wrist that was too familiar, and then sliding away into a blur. I woke at odd small noises, the thud of a carton being set in the kitchen, the cautious laughter of people arranging a house so it felt like someone else's home might be an enemy. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the faint, comforting sound of human presence in the room next door. Late that night, Callum put a cup of tea in my hands and sat on the edge of the bed like someone who imagines the future in small, tactful steps. "We won't do anything without you," he said. "If you want, tomorrow we can contact people, document things, or we can just get you breakfast. The choice is yours." It was the first time since the crack that began the afternoon that I could imagine a path that didn't involve immediate cowardice or eventual capitulation. The break in my arm had broken more than bone. It split a long internal ledger. Marcus had been a ledger keeper. His pen dipped every time he wanted to note a failure. Now the ledger was messy in a way that might allow blank lines. I lay there and thought of the wrong number, the 3 messages, the improbable care of strangers, the way a simple mistake on a screen had altered the trajectory of my day. "Pale Omega," I'd typed once in a half-mocking, half-proud way on an obscure forum, because queer code has always been where safety and shame intersect. I imagined some of my online acquaintances learning of this and rolling their eyes or making guild jokes. It felt absurd and slightly tender that a username could function like a call sign. Sleep came again in small borrowed pieces. I woke to light through curtains and the smell of cooking.
Voices murmured in the kitchen, and then the clink of ceramic. Dreen's laughter floated through. It had that ridiculous timbre that said someone had successfully burned toast and was proud.
"Breakfast," he announced, as if we'd all achieved something heroic. He had made pancakes again because he is some kind of stress baker and because the ritual of food is a language everyone learns. When I shuffled into the kitchen, the sight of 3 people moving like domestic angels felt both incongruous and quietly right. The house was tidy like a promise, no clutter, no trophies, just clean surfaces and a sense of waiting that didn't demand an explanation. My mother texted, and the phone didn't feel like an accusation anymore. She wrote a string of messages. "Where are you? Are you all right? I'm on the way." I told her where I was, because lying felt like a thing I couldn't do with food in the house and people who had already walked in. Her reply came, uncertain and fierce, a kind of soft armor. I knew there would be calls later, logistical and brutal, the kinds of conversations that would require permits of courage. But right now, in the kitchen with the aroma of browned batter, the present was tethered to warmth. They clinked mugs when I sat down, not ceremonious but human. "To wrong numbers," Dine said, and we all laughed, a little too loud, because humor is a kind of social suturing. When they asked if I wanted to stay another night or longer, the question was open. The offer stood like a doorway. Marcus's key was still an ugly fact, but 3 bodies who had crossed the street because a phone made a mistake were another fact. The choices ahead were not clarified by the plaster on my arm. They were complicated and necessary and frightening. I had left a life that had become small, that measured my worth by how obedient I could be to someone else's temper. I had been brought here by strangers and seated at a table with pancakes and an offer. There were more questions than answers. My phone buzzed once more, a small, distant reminder of the world outside this warm house. The day hadn't solved anything, it had only opened another room to live in for now. I sipped the tea and felt the warmth in my chest bleed into the cold edges of fear. For the first time since the crack, the future seemed to have a hinge. If you are in danger, contact local emergency services or a domestic violence hotline. Stay safe. The house settled into a kind of ordinary rhythm that felt dangerously luxurious. The hum of a dishwasher like a lullaby, the soft scrape of a broom, the way the light came through curtains and made everything forgiving. For the first time since the crack in my arm I'd started calling the day, the noises of a place didn't feel like they were cataloging what I had done wrong. They just were. It was a small mercy. My mother arrived in a flurry of grief and efficiency, hair in a hasty bun, one hand gripping a canvas tote, and the other already on my shoulder, as if she'd been practicing this move my whole life. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath until she took it for me and didn't let go. "Elliot," she said in that voice, that used to mean bandages and boiled rice, and "you can tell me anything." And I felt like a child who'd finally been handed permission to stop pretending the bruise wasn't there. She looked at my cast like a foreign thing, and then up at the men clustered like good weather at the kitchen table. Wes with his narrowed, efficient eyes, Dien with syrup on his lip like a badge, Callum with his steady, unintrusive warmth. She did not ask for details. She asked for tea, then sandwiches, then where I'd want to be next. She and Callum had the kind of instant, awkward rapport that forms between 2 people who both know how to care. Practical, no badges, no pity. "I'm glad they're here," she said, and the way she watched Wes when she said it told me she wasn't only talking about my arm. Her phone was already open to the list of people she could call. Somewhere in the chain of custody of love, she had reprioritized. Her whole face shifted from the habit of being kept distant to the shock of being needed. I explained in small parcels what had happened.
I left out the worst parts in the way survivors do, because refinement is a survival art. When Marcus had left the apartment, the part I could say was the practical one. When I told her about the wrong number and the messages and the way 3 strangers had come, she made an odd, small sound in her throat that might have been amusement or grief, and then she hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe for a second. "You're not alone," she said, and that phrase lodged like a warm stone. There was paperwork, if you want to make a report, and warmth, stay here as long as you like. My mother stayed in the spare room like she had never quite forgiven herself for not seeing things earlier, but then stopped apologizing and started asking what I would need to sleep. That shift, the move from guilt to logistics, felt like progress. People came by, briefly, at my request, and not because someone thought they'd earned a place. A woman from a local clinic, non-profit, quiet, left a leaflet that looked less like a demand and more like an extended hand. Callum texted a friend who could advise on temporary legal things without sounding like a legal documentary. Deanne baked bread in the evenings and left it on the counter like an offering to the small domestic gods. For a day, things were discreetly normal, but normal is a fragile costume. Marcus lives in the kind of machinery that levers goodwill into control. The potency of his smile isn't a comic detail, it's his weaponized currency. He had not disappeared from the narrative. He rearranged himself around it. It started small, a message that came through at noon on my phone, short and polite. "Elliot, are you home?" my number said, as if an echo had decided to be a voice. The timing was wrong. The phrase had a template cadence I recognized from hundreds of small manipulations. The men gathered like a chorus around this tiny, awful stage.
"That's—" Wes started, and Callum's hand went to the device to study it like a physical object. "It's not always what it looks like," my mother said, wary and tired, because she'd learned in the past that appearances are exactly where he liked to anchor his truth. For a second, I wanted to pick up the phone and throw it, to have something inanimate to lash against. Wes exhaled and said the one word that felt like a category and a shield: spoofing. He didn't explain. The word was a hand wave that meant plausible explanation, manipulative technique, don't take it as fact. It was an admission that we were dancing with a cunning opponent who could make things look like a message for me and not be me at all. "Don't reply," Callum said, a gentler echo of the message that had saved me before. "If he can see you responding, it undermines what we have. Let us handle it." For the first time in weeks, I grasped that the technology that had saved me could just as easily be turned against me. The wrong number had been a doorway in. The same digital architecture could be used to build a trap. It felt like a betrayal by the medium that had at once been salvation and lie. Marcus's touch was everywhere through those thin screens. His account of me, his curated persona, the strings of small interactions that made me appear needy or dramatic to anyone who hadn't lived in the rooms he occupied with his smile. He'd trained people to accept his version of events. He'd painted me as fragile and irrational in polite conversations until the world learned not to listen too closely. It takes time to undo that kind of story. He turned up at the curb in front of the house like a movie extra who'd been told to look casual but threatening. He'd taken on that look of quiet worry he saves for social functions, concern in his brow, a bag slung over one shoulder like a husband returning from errands. The way he moves through public spaces has an armor of normalcy. People oblige normal. Dean saw Marcus first from the kitchen window, the movement of a figure in the lane, a repetition of gait that had been memorized. He said the name flatly, as if stating a fact might make it less ominous. "That's him," he announced, and then added a joke that landed like an attempt to soften the moment. "He looks like he edited his face for a mugshot." Marcus approached the stoop with the practiced calm of someone who knows how to manipulate perception. "Elliot,"
he called, louder than necessary. Baby, He called me baby like a weapon. The tone was practiced, lubricated with faux concern. My throat closed just a little on the syllable because it carried the weight of months of being reduced to a role. He smiled at my mother and made the very small effort of the charming liar, the tilted head, the remembered gift in the past, the apology on the edge of a plea. I'm worried, he said. Someone's alarmed your neighbors. Where are you staying?
I can come in. Don't, Wes said. The word was short and unyielding, the kind of authority he only used when politeness had died on the vine. He stepped forward with the quiet posture of someone who knows how to use minimal motion for maximum barrier. Marcus's smile didn't crumble, it bent, the way a reed bows but doesn't break. He turned to me, and for a moment the old piano notes of our lives played under his words. Look, he said, I didn't mean... Please leave, Callum said. It was a request, edged but not bloodthirsty. He pictured a line in the sand. You can talk here if you want to talk later through a lawyer, but right now you need to go. You know how to get out. Marcus looked at the three of them like he was mapping the resistance. For a second I could read the calculations slide across his expression, the displays he could marshal, the friends he could charm into corroboration. Then he did something I didn't expect. He turned his head and faced the street. His phone flashed, and then he held it up like proof. He's saying he's fine, Marcus said, voice smooth. Look at this, it's from his number. He said to come home. The neighbors' faces edged towards us, curiosity folding into opinion. The phone was a prop and a weapon. A quick photograph and a tweet could rearrange an afternoon. For a second, the scene hung in public judgment. Wes walked to the curb and took the phone from Marcus's hand with the blunt permission of possession. Marcus protested with the thin protest of a man who expected compliance. Wes scrolled, eyes trained on tiny details, timestamps, threads, the invisible morphology of digital conversation. He didn't show us what he saw. He made a single private sound. Those are new threads, he said, and the word was both observation and condemnation. They didn't start before he left. They're being pushed from outside. Callum put a steadying hand on my back. It's manipulation, he said to the cluster of neighbors. He didn't shout it like an accusation. He said it like an explanation, because in a world where credibility matters, explanations concede doubt. Marcus didn't leave. He stood on the sidewalk, all warm charm and the sort of dignity built on rehearsed apologetics. But he also shifted. His smile thinned when he thought no one was looking, and his jaw worked like a man trying to choose weapons from a tray. He left that afternoon with the sort of slow craftiness that meant this was not over. He left the energy of threat in the air, the sense that he had unfinished business, that he could sculpt appearances like a clay he refused to share. The men watched him go with that quiet professional attention you only get with people who have made protecting others into a practice. We had edged into a kind of guerrilla strategy, fewer declarations in public, more documentation, more witnesses, fewer words that might be twisted. We're making records, Wes said once Marcus was out of sight. Screenshots.
Times. Witness names. We'll put them together, just in case you want to go to the authorities. The word authorities made my stomach flip. There are reasons survivors hesitate. Phones that look like exculpatory evidence when a manipulator has both the cunning and the social ease to make a story persuasive. There are reasons people choose the small, private path first. But there is also power in documentation, in telling the story where it accrues weight. They're not guaranteeing anything, my mother said slowly, but the more you have, the photos, the clinic notes, the more someone will have to take seriously. I swallowed. I was tired of being made into a thing that needed permission to be believed. But I was also cautious.
Not yet, I told Wes. Not this afternoon. Callum nodded. Then we document. We keep it safe, and if you tell us you want them called, we call. That night, Marcus sent a different message, something small and insinuating that didn't sound like a demand. Look, let's talk. I didn't mean to hurt you. I read it 3 times on the tiny glow of the phone and felt the old reflex of apology knot in my chest. This is what narcissists do, offer a repair that always requires the injured party to accept labor in the name of reconciliation. The phrase was a kind of poison pill. It sounded like closure, and it wasn't. I deleted it, not because I was strong, but because it felt like an act of defiance that cost me nothing. The deletion felt small and steadying, like a weight off the hand. The house put its own measures in place. Wes reconfigured a few locks, nothing illegal, nothing explicatory, little domestic safeguards that meant more than security. He changed a couple of passcodes and suggested we alter routine routes to the store. Callum sat with me and went through my phone in a way that was both practical and non-invasive. How to enable 2-factor on accounts, what email addresses were active, which social feeds needed private settings. I consented to each change because choice had become a new muscle. That night, after the lights in the living room were dimmed and the house hummed like a breath, Callum made tea and sat on the edge of my bed as if proximity itself could be a kind of remedy. "You're doing all the things that are hard," he said, and he didn't say it like a list of chores. He said it like a recognition. You got help. You left the room. You let people who didn't take your arm for a sign of weakness care for you. I wanted to let the gratitude pour out, but the old ledger of shame was patient. "I still feel like theft," I confessed, "like I don't deserve this much attention, like I'm an inconvenience." He didn't laugh. He smiled the sort of quiet smile that understands how shame works. "You deserve safety," he said. "Attention is not a punishment, it's an investment." June, true to form, ran late to our confessional with plastic forks and a badly burned lemon tart.
He sat cross-legged on the floor and started a story about someone who'd tried to return a plant because it didn't thrive under their dominant aesthetic. And somehow it was the most human thing in the room, a grotesque parable about taste and control that made us all laugh until we choked a little. Laughter in that house was a disinfectant. It didn't heal, but it cleaned the edges enough to function. We traded small annoyances and absurdities, password ideas, a faux epic ranking of household appliances. My gratitude for these men made my chest hurt in a good way. There was trust blooming, awkward and tentative, and absolutely human. A week later, the pattern of threat shifted. Marcus started a whisper campaign through people we'd both known, mutual acquaintances who had been taught to see him as a benefactor and me as a difficult child. He sent messages to people we were mutually acquainted with. He posted an oblique, performative concern post online that celebrated vulnerability and called for patience. The message was subtle, public relations in the language of pity. He wanted traction, a return to the social orbit that allowed manipulation to run on autopilot. The man and I sat in the living room and scrolled like a small jury, marking instances of behavior that could be called out. We printed screenshots and stacked them like evidence, not to escalate into a spectacle, but to collect truth in ways that would be legible to anyone inclined to ask. My mother came every other day with casseroles and an impatience for legal ambiguity. "What if he tries to get the cops to take you home?" she asked one afternoon, hands aggressively folded around a mug. "What if he lies to them?" "Then we'll have paperwork," Wes said. "That's how the world works. You don't get magic justice, but you get records." Records feel like cotton sometimes, soft and invisible. Callum reached for her hand. "They can be heavier than they look. They can be the hook you need."
We walked a careful line between building evidence and not turning our lives into a courtroom. There's dignity in secrecy and dignity in naming, and the balance between them is something you negotiate like a treaty. The day Marcus tried the other pressure tactic, the public lie, was the day he underestimated the fact that proximity creates witness. He showed up at my old office building and made a spectacle of concern in front of a coworker who I'd once confided in years ago. She'd seen the pattern begin, and she'd kept her own distance. He'd used that to manipulate the narrative. But now, with witnesses and with people who had no patience for revisionist histories, his performance didn't land the way he wanted. He used my image in public like a mirror that flattered him and blamed me. He posted a picture on social media that implied I'd left because of drama, that I was unstable, that his attempts at contact were merely boyfriendly concern.
It was vile in its cruelty and banal in the way it hid behind quotidian words. Fans in small pockets online started to chime, people who'd admired my handle, Pale Omega, for reasons that had nothing to do with my life and everything to do with a forum in which we pretended vulnerability was a kind of cosplay. Some of them reached out with carefully phrased messages that swung between stay safe and that's his side too. The internet is a strange animal. It holds empathy and cruelty in equal measure and gives both the same microphone. I started to do little things to reclaim my narrative that didn't look like grand acts. I wrote small factual notes and saved them to a folder called Today. A line, January 17th, left apartment at 3:20 p.m. because bone break, clinic visit, 3 strangers came. Another, phone texts from XYZ numbers, screenshots saved. The process of writing felt like making a map out of chaos. The men were patient teachers in this. Wes taught me not to be performative about my boundaries, but rigorous. Drone kept offering ridiculous mantras. If you can't mace it, bake it, he'd deadpan. And Callum, like always, sat with me and made sure my wrists were elevated at night. It was a new choreography of living. One afternoon, things took a sharper turn. Marcus approached the house not with charm, but with the kind of naked fury that shows when someone has been denied a narrative. He tried the stoop again, but this time he was different, sharper, eyes colder. He called my name like an accusation. Elliot, he yelled, because the public is useful when you want to dramatize. Wes met him at the front gate. There was a moment, a silent, heavy thing, where the two of them weighed each other. Marcus's jaw was firm. You can't keep him, he said. The claim was not a question, it was a declaration. You don't get to decide that, Wes answered. His voice was the same measured tone he'd used before. This is his life. Marcus smiled like he'd heard a private joke. He stepped forward, and for a second I imagined everything tilting back to the way it had been. The possibility of surrender is always present in trauma. It's a small exit sign that's sometimes impossible to ignore. I felt it. It was a hot, dizzy idea. Go back, make it normal again, take the familiar shape. I shook my head so hard it made the world blur. No, I said, not loud, but solid. He looked at me with the kind of hurt that has always been performative when he does it in public. You don't know what you're doing, he said. You're making a mistake. Maybe I am, I said. It was not a confession to weakness. It was an admission that the future is always composed of uncertain choices. But it's mine. The police were called, not by us, but by a neighbor who didn't know all the histories and only saw a man being asked to leave a house. 2 officers arrived with the machinery of official business, clipboards, a polite politeness.
They asked for statements. They asked for names. They asked for the phone number Marcus said he'd used. Marcus produced his own version of events with practiced gentility. He spoke like the man who makes alibis pleasurable.
Wes and Callum and Drain offered their observations. My mother cried intermittently and used language that had the blunt, knotty honesty of people who have been waiting too long to be believed. I gave a statement that was as much as I could bear for then, and the clerk wrote it down with bureaucratic impartiality. The officers were neither monsters nor angels. They were the imperfect instruments of a system that is both necessary and flawed. One of them explained how orders and restraining mechanisms worked and didn't work, the caveats appearing like dull, bureaucratic teeth. "We can take a report," he said. "We can look into trespassing if he enters property and you wish to press it. For an emergency protective order, we'd need to file paperwork, and it takes time." It's strange how the law is at once a lighthouse and an ocean, a guiding structure that is sometimes too vast to feel immediate help. The officer's words were careful. "If you change your mind," he said to me, "call us." Marcus left that day not in defeat, but in retreat, and it was a difference that mattered. He was not powerless. He had lost theatrical access. He was constrained to a different strategy, slowing, undermining. For now he was still out in the world, and we were carefully making the world less accessible to him. We were building small fences. Nights were the hardest. My sleep was a narrow thing. I woke to the phantom feel of hands where none had been, the imagined crack of a bottle that never came. It is a curious cruelty that absence can be loud. Callum slept on the couch many nights, and sometimes his presence felt like a physical promise. At other times, it felt like a reminder that a person could be willingly near, and that closeness, for now, was elective and safe. We didn't talk about love, we talked about plans, and it was a relief. Love is a freighted word in a time of repair. Plans are less romantic and more like scaffolding. Change your passwords here, hide your spare keys there. Don't let anyone who is not welcome into your schedule. We spoke in inventories. It felt adulting and oddly intimate. Months passed in the small geometry of careful living. There were days when the world outside the house seemed to forget me, which is both a relief and a danger. There were days when someone would shout at the news about a celebrity, and I'd think for a second we'd been shoved back into normalcy. Normal comes back in small, everyday acts. A neighbor bringing over a plant, the mail being delivered, the way time itself heals through repetition. He didn't disappear. Marcus continued to orbit, his attempts to shape perception, connecting like tributaries to his broader need for control.
There were messages that looked like me, public posts that made me into an object of pity, some friendly contacts who took his side because he'd trained them to do so. It was tiring to see the same old loops. It was instructive, too. You could track his patterns like a weather report. Where he couldn't intimidate directly, he'd try to confound. I started therapy a few weeks after the incident. The room smelled like coffee and a neutral perfume. My therapist had a notebook with careful lines. We talked about small things first: sleep, appetite, the way certain noises made me tiny inside. And then we talked about the break itself, the body and the memory of it. My arm still bore the white cast like a flag. He asked how it had felt when strangers messaged me. Relieved, I said, and then laughed at my own simplicity. Also guilty and dumb for being saved by strangers somehow. Healing isn't linear, he said. It's a rope ladder. You climb, you slip, you climb again. I liked the metaphor because it imagined both effort and progress. Progress felt incremental. It felt like a slow, stubborn tide. There were moments of surprising tenderness. One night, Callum and I sat on the roof,
because sometimes the house offers a top that makes the world seem less claustrophobic, and he showed me a scar on his knuckle from something ordinary, pizza making in his teen years. He talked about the things he feared, small, clumsy things, and I told him about the way Marcus had once fixed the light bulb in the hallway and praised me in the kind of way that made me forget how to breathe. I thought at the time I was the problem, I admitted, that if I only made the right choices, I'd be rewarded with normal. Callum squeezed my hand and said, "Normal is not a reward. Normal is permission. You had permission taken from you. We're just helping make the permit again." The language was imperfect, but kind. It helped. We kept documenting. There were visits we recorded in the little map of what happened and who saw it. We saved screenshots and images in a folder on a hard drive that resembled a private archive. It felt less like paranoid collection and more like the careful judicial preparation of a person demanding to be seen for who they were. At some point, something small and ordinary happened that mattered a lot. I went outside on my own and walked to the end of the block and back. It took all morning and a stew of courage, but when I returned, I felt a little more owned by my own feet. The men met me at the threshold of the house with nothing heavy to say. They watched me like people who'd been entrusted with the guard of something delicate. Their watchfulness was not ownership, it was presence. "You look like the same height," Droon said, "like an idiot," which made me laugh until my chest felt loose. Humor continues to be the disruptive secret weapon. It erases the holy solemnity of trauma in tiny doses and leaves the possibility of ordinary life.
We are not only our worst days. On the anniversary of the wrong number, one small month after the break, I found myself sitting in the kitchen with Callum and my mother, looking at a calendar like a weather map of our time. There was no ceremony, just a clink of mugs and the soft radio. The day felt both epochal and trivial. "To wrong numbers," Dwayne said again, "because some rituals get repeated until they're ritual." We smiled and raised our cups. The clink sounded like a closure that isn't closure. It was an agreement to stay for the next page, not to finish the book. The world remained imperfect. Marcus sent yet another public post, this time a passive-aggressive meme about miscommunication that implied more than it said. He learned to weaponize ellipses. People commented. A few friends unfriended me without explanation, and a few more stepped forward with private messages of support. It was an ugly geometry to navigate. Friendships reconfigured. People pick sides, sometimes without reason. It hurt in a very particular way to lose someone who'd been trained to see me only as the version Marcus had narrated. I told my mother I might press charges later. She held my hand like a benediction, and then, in private, she cried for a long time. "It should have been different," she said between hiccups. "We should have seen it." And I told her that we were doing it differently now, and that the seeing mattered in real time. There was a day when Marcus's attempts at proximity finally required a boundary with teeth. He came to the house one rain-slicked morning and left a bouquet on the doormat with a note that was performative in its apology. The neighbors saw it. My mother saw it. The men saw it. It was a transparent move meant to poke and prod. West took the bouquet and, without ceremony, threw it in the compost. "Flowers are for funerals," he said, blunt, and we laughed because it was too petty not to be funny. Marcus kept trying, but the world had new scaffolding now. Where he sought to stitch narratives of charm, he found instead witnesses who would say, plainly, no. Where he tried to isolate, he found groups who would not let him. I started writing small posts under my own name,
private, not public, that narrated little truths. Not a manifesto, not a call-out, just a few sentences. I broke a bone. I'm healing. I'm getting help. I watched how the words settled. Some people commented supportively. Some argued. Others didn't respond. Each interaction taught me something about the people I thought I knew. Months turned. My arm healed into a slightly uneven thing. The cast came off with a small ceremony in the clinic, the nurse warning me about using the hand again too fast. I was clumsy at first, like relearning a language. My hand had its own small rebellions, twitches, numbness, and I learned patience in tiny increments. Pick up a cup, write a line, carry a bag. The men remained my friends, not saviors. They lived their lives and made space for mine.
Dane volunteered at a bakery and brought back quartets of pastries like a man who believed small acts might redeem large mistakes. Wes, in his way, started a habit of leaving a spare set of keys with my mother, not for control, but for safety's sake. Callum and I did not define what we were. There was no romance slapped on like lipstick. There was the possibility of something like trust, which is enough for now. One evening, months after the first crack, we gathered at the kitchen table like an awkward family at a holiday. The light was soft, and someone had been overzealous with cinnamon. The radio played a song about roads and returns. My mother had insisted on a roast, even though she hated being domestic, and Dane had brought a pie that had collapsed in the center, like a heart. We ate and joked, and then, in a small, mischievous mood, Dane raised his mug. "To wrong numbers," he said, and the table laughed as if it were the first time all over again. We clinked, and my hand, which had once been broken, made the movement of toasting like a barometer of progress. That night, in the small, hot hum of the kitchen, Callum and I stood at the sink, washing plates. The domesticity of it felt oddly sacred. He looked at me and said, quietly, "You've done really hard things." "So have you," I told him, not only because he had tended me, but because he'd stayed near enough to be a witness. He smiled. "Staying's underrated," he said. "Maybe it's boring, but it's what makes houses into homes." We didn't promise anything dramatic. We didn't make vows or declare intentions we couldn't keep. We acknowledged what we had. Days of safety, friends who didn't turn away when things got messy, a mother who'd chosen to be present. We had a small constellation of guardians and an evolving sense of my own boundaries. Now the file of my life looks different. Where once the ledger was all Marcus's entries, his small corrections, now there are my own notations, messy and whole. There will be court filings, perhaps, in time. There will be uncomfortable conversations and the slow, sometimes grinding work of reclaiming social circles. There will be therapy sessions that open more doors. And sometimes there will be days that I will trip and feel small and doubt my choices and wish the clean, convenient narrative had been true. But there will also be pancakes at midnight and men who bake without being asked and a mother who is learning not to fix but to listen. There will be the small, fierce acts of choosing myself in the spaces I inhabit. There will be the rightness of people who show up when asked, without making you owe them for the air they gave. If you are in danger, contact local emergency services or a domestic violence hotline. There are people and systems that can help, and it's okay to ask for help in whatever form feels right to you. We still joke about Pale Omega.
The username that once felt like a private joke on a forum has become a talisman in little ways, a memory of the night that a wrong number turned into a lifeline. I write sometimes under it still, but the voice is steadier now, less hollowed by fear. I contribute to small threads about safety, not to instruct, but to testify that wrong numbers can become right ones. When I imagine the future,
It no longer looks like a closure ceremony where someone else will fix everything. It looks like a messy, open-ended room full of people who will stay near if I ask them to. It looks like mornings where I can make coffee with my left hand and hold a mug in a way that doesn't feel like an accident. It looks like the possibility of choosing new people without old shapes defining them. On a small night with rain tapping like a polite applause on the windows, we clinked mugs, tentative and reverent. Dee said, "To wrong numbers, to soft houses, to people who learn how to hold." We laughed, and the sound filled the kitchen like something that might at some point be mistaken for normalcy. But for now, I held that sound close, because it was earned. If you liked Elliot's Rescue and want more BL Rescue/soft thriller stories, subscribe for the next upload.